It didn't begin with explosions. It didn't begin with fleets. It began with silence. Across the galaxy, communication was everything. Every empire, every civilization, every outpost depended on a constant stream of signals, navigation data, trade routes, diplomatic channels, military coordination. That stream never stopped. Until it did. The first system to go silent was dismissed as a technical anomaly. A remote mining colony on the edge of known space stopped responding to all incoming transmissions. No distress call. No warning. Just absence. Engineers attempted to reconnect. Nothing. Military scouts were dispatched. They never reported back. At first, no one panicked. Systems failed all the time. Equipment broke. Signals were lost. It was inconvenient, but not unusual. Then a second system went dark. Then a third. Then an entire sector. Within hours, long-range communication networks began collapsing in patterns that made no sense. It wasn't random. It wasn't targeted. It was spreading, but not like an infection, and not like an attack. More like a shutdown. As if something was turning the galaxy off, piece by piece. The first investigation. The Auranian Collective, one of the oldest and most advanced civilizations, dispatched a deep space observation fleet to investigate the silent zones. They were careful. They didn't rush in blindly. Long-range sensors scanned the affected systems from a safe distance. What they found made no sense. The stars were still there. Planets still orbited normally. Gravitational systems were intact. Nothing had been destroyed. But there was no activity. No ship movement. No energy signatures. No signals of life. Entire civilizations. Gone without a trace. Not dead. Not evacuated. Just gone. The first fear. Panic didn't spread immediately. It built slowly. Because every empire assumed the same thing. This is not happening to us. They were wrong. Within a single cycle, major communication hubs, centers that connected thousands of systems, began to fail. Emergency protocols activated across the galaxy. Military fleets were mobilized. Defensive formations established. And for the first time in centuries, ancient rival empires opened communication lines. Not to negotiate, but to confirm one thing. Are you seeing this too? The answer was always the same. Yes. Something even worse. Then came the moment everything changed. A frontline observation station, positioned just outside a newly silent system, reported something unusual. Not inside the system, but at its edge. A faint distortion. Almost invisible. Like heat-bending light. Sensors struggled to lock onto it. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't a weapon. It didn't emit energy. It didn't move. It just existed. At the boundary between active space and silence. The station attempted a closer scan. That was their last transmission. The collapse begins. Within minutes, the observation station went silent. Then the nearby fleet. Then the entire sector. This time, it wasn't distant. It was immediate. Empires began pulling back. Borders closed. Trade stopped. Trust vanished. Because whatever this was, it wasn't attacking like an enemy. It wasn't destroying like a weapon. It was removing entire regions from existence, without leaving anything behind. The realization. A high-level emergency council was finally formed. Multiple empires, ancient rivals, forced into the same discussion. For the first time in galactic history, they weren't arguing. They were afraid. One analyst presented the data. Patterns of silence. Expansion rates. System losses. He paused before speaking. Then said the one thing no one wanted to hear. This is not spreading randomly. Silence filled the chamber. He continued. It is moving toward us. And somewhere, far beyond the remaining active stars, the silence kept growing. The galaxy had faced wars before. Empires had risen, clashed, and collapsed countless times across history. Entire species had vanished, and entire systems had been burned to dust. But those wars had something this one did not. Time. There was always time to react. Time to mobilize. Time to understand what was happening. This time, there was none. The Karen Imperium. The first major empire to fall was not weak. It was not unprepared. It was the Karen Imperium, a civilization built on absolute military dominance. Their territory spanned thousands of systems. Their fleets were unmatched. Their defense networks could detect threats before they even formed. If any empire could resist whatever was coming, it was them. And that's exactly why everyone was watching. The line they drew. When the expanding silence approached Karen space, they didn't retreat. They advanced. Massive war fleets were deployed along the outer boundary of their territory. Defensive grids activated. Planetary shields brought online. They didn't intend to observe the phenomenon. They intended to stop it. Their high commander broadcast a message across all known channels. Whatever this force is, it ends here. For the first time since the crisis began, someone was willing to fight. First contact. The Karen fleets waited at the edge of the silent zone. Sensors scanned continuously. Weapons locked and ready. For hours, nothing happened. Then the distortion appeared. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just there. A thin ripple in space, stretching across the entire boundary line. It didn't advance like an army. It didn't strike like a weapon. It simply expanded. Slowly. Calmly. Inevitably. The High Commander gave the order. Fire. The attack that did nothing. Thousands of ships unleashed everything they had. Energy weapons. Kinetic strikes. Gravitational disruptors. Experimental weapons never before used in open conflict. The boundary didn't react. No explosion. No resistance. No impact. The attacks passed into it. And disappeared. As if they had never been fired. Confusion spread across the fleet. Increase power. Change frequency. Target deeper into the field. Nothing worked. It wasn't blocking the attacks. It wasn't absorbing them. It was ignoring them. The first loss. Then, without warning, one of the forward ships vanished. No explosion. No signal loss. No system failure. It simply ceased to exist. The fleet froze. Confirm loss. Sensor error. Reacquire target. There was nothing to reacquire. The ship wasn't destroyed. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't hidden. It was gone. Panic begins. More ships disappeared. One by one. Then in groups. Then entire formations. Still no signs of attack. No incoming fire. No enemy presence. Just absence spreading through their ranks. For the first time in their history, the Karen Imperium hesitated. Because they didn't know what they were fighting. Or if they were fighting anything at all. The retreat order. The High Commander finally made the call no Karen leader had ever made. Fall back. The fleets turned. Engines ignited. They began to retreat. But something was wrong. Navigation systems started failing. Not completely. Just inconsistently. Coordinates shifted. Distances changed. Ships that should have been seconds apart suddenly registered as light years away. Formation broke. Control collapsed. The collapse. And then it happened. The boundary didn't chase them. It didn't accelerate. It didn't need to. Because space itself began changing. The region behind the fleet, their own territory, started going silent. System by system. World by world. Everything they were retreating toward was already gone. The last transmission. The final message from the Karen Imperium wasn't a battle report. It wasn't a call for help. It was a realization. Broadcast across every frequency, repeating until the signal itself vanished. We did not lose to an enemy. A pause. We were erased by something that does not recognize us as something that can exist. Then, nothing. The aftermath. Within a single cycle. The Karen Imperium was gone. Not defeated. Not conquered. Erased. As if it had never been part of the galaxy at all. And the worst part? There were no survivors to confirm it. Only the empty space where one of the most powerful empires had once stood. Across the galaxy, the message was clear. This was not a war that could be fought. And yet, every empire began preparing for it anyway. The fall of the Karen Imperium should have united the galaxy. It should have forced every remaining civilization into cooperation. Shared defenses, shared intelligence, a single coordinated response against whatever was erasing entire regions of space. Instead, it did the opposite. The first fracture. The moment the Karen Imperium vanished, something changed, not in space, but in perception. Different empires recorded the event differently. Some saw the boundary expand slowly. Others claimed it surged forward instantly. A few insisted the Karen fleets had triggered the collapse themselves. And some reported seeing nothing at all. The same event. Multiple versions. All equally convincing. All impossible to reconcile. That was the first fracture. Because if no one could agree on what had happened, they couldn't agree on what to do next. Blame. Fear turned into suspicion. Suspicion turned into accusation. The Valari Union accused the Auranian Collective of withholding critical data. The Auranian Collective accused the Valari of falsifying reports. Smaller civilizations claimed the larger empires had caused the silence through experimental weapons. And the larger empires didn't deny it fast enough. Trust collapsed faster than any star system. Because in a galaxy where entire empires could vanish without explanation, everyone needed someone to blame. The first shot. It didn't begin as a war. It began as a misunderstanding. A joint observation fleet, made up of multiple civilizations, was stationed near a neutral sector, monitoring the edge of a newly forming silent zone. Communication was already strained. Data discrepancies had made coordination difficult. Then one ship detected something. A spike. An anomaly. Its sensors identified it as a potential expansion of the silence. It transmitted a warning. But due to signal delay and interpretation errors, another ship received that warning as a hostile action. Their systems flagged it as an attack signature. And they reacted. They fired. Chain reaction. The moment the first shot was fired, everything collapsed. All ships in the fleet began reacting to different versions of the same event. Some believed they were under attack. Some believed they were defending themselves. Some saw nothing at all, but reacted to the panic around them. Weapons activated across the formation. Alliances shattered instantly. Within minutes, the observation fleet had turned into a battlefield. Ships that had stood side by side just moments ago were now destroying each other. And the worst part? Every side believed they were right. The spread. News of the incident spread across the galaxy. Not as a single report, but as dozens of conflicting versions. Each civilization received a different story. One version blamed the Valari Union. Another blamed the Auranian Collective. A third claimed it was sabotage by an unknown faction. A fourth insisted it was proof that no one could be trusted. There was no way to confirm the truth. Because every attempt to verify it only created more contradictions. And in that uncertainty, fear made the decision for them. War ignites. Empires began mobilizing, not against the silence, but against each other. Defensive measures turned into preemptive strikes. Alliances broke. Borders became battle lines. Entire fleets were deployed not to stop the collapse, but to protect themselves from other survivors. Because if the silence didn't destroy them, someone else would. The tragic realization. Some leaders tried to stop it. They called for ceasefires, for unity, for reason. But their messages arrived too late. Or were misinterpreted, or contradicted by other data streams. In a galaxy where reality itself was becoming unreliable, peace was impossible to coordinate. One commander, watching the first major inter-empire battle unfold, said quietly, "We are doing exactly what it wants." No one responded, because no one knew what it was, or if it even existed. The silence advances. And through it all, the silence kept moving, unchanged, unaffected, indifferent. It did not react to the war. It did not accelerate. It did not slow down. It simply continued expanding, while the surviving empires tore each other apart. The real threat didn't need to do anything. The collapse begins. The galaxy had entered its next phase. Not just collapse of space, but collapse of trust. Because now, there were two wars. One against something no one could fight, and one against each other. And the second war was making the first one inevitable. By the time the survivors turned on each other, one truth had become impossible to ignore. Nothing they had done so far had slowed the collapse. Not fleets. Not defenses. Not retreat. So they did what desperate empires always do. They built a weapon. The idea. It came from a coalition of rival powers who had briefly stopped fighting long enough to share one goal. If the silence cannot be stopped, it must be forced to react. Because that was the problem. The silence didn't behave like an enemy. It didn't respond to attacks. It didn't adapt. It didn't acknowledge anything. And that made it unbeatable. So the plan was simple. They would create something so powerful, so disruptive, that the silence would have no choice but to respond. And in that response, they would finally understand it. The weapon. They called it the null core. Not a bomb. Not a conventional weapon. But a device designed to do something no technology had ever attempted before. It would temporarily erase a region of space from existence. Not destroy it. Not collapse it. Erase it. A controlled version of what the silence itself was doing. The logic was dangerous, but convincing. If we can replicate its behavior, we can control it. The null core was assembled in secret, powered by the combined energy output of multiple star systems, stabilized using experimental physics that had never been tested outside simulations. It was unstable, unpredictable, but it was the only option left. The test. They chose a location carefully, a dead system, already on the edge of a silent zone, far enough from active civilizations to minimize risk, close enough to guarantee interaction. The fleets gathered at a safe distance. Observers from multiple empires watched. For the first time since the war began, there was a sense of control, a plan, a direction. The command was given. Activate the null core. The first success. For a brief moment, it worked. The device activated. Space itself seemed to fold inward, collapsing into a single point before vanishing entirely. An entire region of space. Gone. Cleanly. Instantly. No debris. No energy release. Just absence. The observers were stunned. They had done it. They had created something that matched the silence. For the first time, they were not powerless. Then everything changed. At the edge of the erased region, the silence reacted. For the first time since the war began, it moved differently. Not faster, not slower, but aware. The boundary didn't expand. It adjusted. The distortion shifted, bending toward the null cause effect, as if it recognized something familiar, or something wrong. Sensors struggled to process what they were seeing, because the behavior didn't match anything they had observed before. And then, the impossible happened. The merge. The erased region didn't stay empty. It changed. The absence left behind by the null core began to fill. Not with matter. Not with energy. But with the same distortion as the silence. Only denser. Stronger. More defined. The weapon hadn't pushed the silence back. It had connected to it. Amplified it. The spread accelerates. Without warning, the boundary expanded. Faster than ever before. Systems that should have taken cycles to reach vanished in moments. Observation fleets barely had time to retreat. Some didn't. Entire armadas were swallowed instantly. No warning. No resistance. Just gone. The realization. Panic spread across the coalition. Emergency shutdown commands were issued. But it was too late. The null core was still active. And now it wasn't just affecting one region. It was feeding the expansion. One scientist, watching the data spiral out of control, said the words that ended all hope. We didn't attack it. A pause. We made it stronger. The final transmission. The last message from the null core control station was short. Broken. Desperate. It's not reacting like an enemy. Static. It's adapting like we're part of it. More static. We just helped it spread. Signal lost. The aftermath. Within a single cycle, the expansion rate of the silence doubled. Then tripled. Then became impossible to measure. The weapon that was meant to save the galaxy had ensured its collapse. And now, every remaining civilization understood something terrifying. They were not just losing the war. They were accelerating it. After the failure of the null core, something inside the galaxy broke. Not physically, not even strategically, but psychologically. For the first time, every surviving empire understood the same truth at the same moment. Nothing they did was helping. Every action, every defense, every attack, every attempt to understand, was making things worse. And yet, they still couldn't stop. The proposal, the idea of a final alliance didn't come from hope. It came from desperation. A transmission spread across the remaining active systems, one that bypassed political channels, military codes, and diplomatic protocols. It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a request. It was a question. If we cannot stop it, can we outlast it? At first, no one responded. Then, slowly, one by one, they did. Because there was nothing left to lose. The gathering. For the first time in recorded history, enemies met without weapons. Not in orbit. Not across secure channels. But physically, on a neutral, hidden world far from the expanding silence. Leaders of rival empires stood in the same chamber. Species that had been at war for centuries now facing the same problem. No fleets. No guards. Just truth. And the truth was simple. We cannot fight this. That statement was not debated. It was accepted. The plan. If the silence could not be destroyed, and interacting with it only made it stronger, then the only option left was to do nothing. Not retreat. Not defend. Not attack. But completely withdraw from the system that had defined galactic civilization. Interaction itself. They called it the Severance Protocol. A final, irreversible step. Shut down all long-range communication. Disable interstellar travel networks. Collapse trade routes. Isolate every civilization from every other. End all coordinated activity across the galaxy. No signals. No movement. No shared data. No war. No cooperation. Nothing. The logic was terrifying, but consistent. If the collapse feeds on connection, we remove connection. Each civilization would become its own isolated existence. No allies. No enemies. No galaxy. The doubt. Not everyone agreed. Some argued that isolation would only make them easier targets. Others believed the silence would continue regardless. A few insisted that giving up the galaxy was worse than extinction. But in the end, those arguments didn't matter, because every alternative had already failed. The decision. One by one, the leaders made their choice. Not through votes. Not through treaties. But through action. Fleets were recalled. Communication hubs shut down. Navigation networks dismantled. Entire civilizations began disconnecting themselves from everything they had ever built. It was not surrender. It was abandonment. The moment it began. The first system to activate the Severance Protocol went completely dark. Not like the silence. Different. Intentional. Controlled. Their signals didn't fade. They stopped. Immediately. Then another system followed. Then another. Across the galaxy, lights began going out. But this time, it was by choice. Something went wrong. At first, it seemed to work. The regions that disconnected themselves did not immediately vanish. The silence continued expanding, but it no longer reacted to those isolated systems in the same way. Hope returned. For a moment. Then the data changed. The silent zones began to behave differently around the disconnected regions. Not avoiding them. Not ignoring them. but surrounding them, like water flowing around stones, isolating them further, cutting them off completely, and then, slowly, closing in. The final realization. The Alliance had made one critical mistake. They believed the silence was reacting to connection. It wasn't. It was defining it. By isolating themselves, they hadn't escaped the system. They had completed it. Each disconnected civilization became a closed unit. Predictable. Contained. Easy to resolve. One leader, moments before their system went silent, sent a final message into the fading network. We thought becoming separate would save us. A pause. But we just made it easier to erase us one by one. The collapse continues. The last alliance never formally ended. There was no betrayal. No final battle. No disagreement. Because by the time they understood their mistake, they were already gone. One system at a time. One isolated world after another. The galaxy wasn't just collapsing anymore. It was being simplified. By the time the last alliance vanished, the galaxy was no longer a network. It was a collection of fading points. Isolated systems. Broken routes. Silent worlds waiting for something they could no longer understand. And in one of those systems, hidden, overlooked, and barely functional, a discovery was made. Too late to matter, but important enough to change everything. The Forgotten Station. The discovery didn't come from a powerful empire or a surviving fleet. It came from a forgotten research station orbiting a dim, unstable star. Its creators had vanished cycles ago. Its systems were damaged. Its purpose, almost erased. Almost. Because one protocol was still running. An automated analysis of the silence. Not recent data. Not battlefield observations. But long-term patterns. Deep patterns. The kind no one had time to study during the chaos. The pattern. The station had been watching since the beginning. Tracking every system that went silent. Every expansion of the boundary. Every failed attempt to stop it. And over time, it noticed something no one else had. The silence was not expanding randomly. It was not spreading outward like an infection. It was moving with precision. Following a structure. At first, the data didn't make sense. Until the station overlaid one more layer. Ancient star maps. Not current ones. Old ones. From before the war. Before the collapse. Before even the first silent system. And that's when the pattern aligned. Perfectly. The hidden structure. The silence wasn't destroying the galaxy. It was revealing something that had always been there. A structure. A hidden arrangement beneath normal space. The positions of stars, systems, entire regions. They weren't random. They formed a design. One that could only be seen when enough of them were gone. The silence wasn't spreading. It was uncovering the truth. The station's final analysis produced a conclusion no one was left to hear. The galaxy was never a natural formation. Pause. It was a constructed system. Another pause. And it is being dismantled. The stars. The civilizations. The entire network of existence. It had been arranged. Placed. Connected for a purpose. And now, that purpose was over. The implication. This changed everything. And nothing. Because it explained the behavior of the silence. Why it ignored attacks. Why it didn't behave like an enemy. Why it reacted strangely to interaction. Why isolation made things worse. Because it wasn't a force of destruction. It was a process. A dismantling sequence. Everything that existed was being taken apart in the order it had been built. The missing piece. There was one more detail. One final anomaly in the pattern. A region the silence had not yet reached. Not because it was far away. Not because it was protected. But because it didn't fit the structure. A system that wasn't aligned with the rest. A star that didn't belong. A place that had no connection to the original design. The station marked it clearly. Unmapped origin point. The last transmission. With what little power remained, the station sent one final message. Not to a specific empire. Not to a fleet. Just outward. Into whatever was still listening. The collapse is not random. The galaxy is being taken apart. But one system was never part of it. Signal weakened. If anything can survive. Final flicker. It will be there. Too late. The message reached almost no one. Most civilizations were already gone. Those that received it were too isolated to act. And those that tried didn't make it. Because the silence was still advancing. Still following its pattern. Still dismantling everything in its path. The final understanding. In its last moment of operation, the station recorded one final thought. Not a conclusion. Not a solution. Just understanding. We were never fighting to survive. A pause. We were part of something that was ending. Then the station went silent. Like everything else. The message should have changed everything. But by the time it reached the last surviving fragments of the galaxy, there was barely anything left to change. The ones who heard it. Only a handful of civilizations received the transmission. Not the strongest. Not the largest. Just the ones who hadn't been erased yet. Scattered fleets. Broken outposts. Isolated worlds clinging to survival without knowing why. And for the first time since the war began, they all had the same goal. Not to fight. Not to defend. But to reach something. The last system. The coordinates in the message didn't point to safety. They pointed to an anomaly. A star system that didn't fit the pattern. One that hadn't been touched by the silence. Not because it was hidden. Not because it was protected. But because it had never been part of the structure being dismantled. That meant one thing. It wasn't supposed to exist. The decision. Every civilization that received the message made the same choice. They would go. Even if it was a trap. Even if it changed nothing. Because staying where they were meant certain erasure. But moving, at least meant possibility. The race begins. Fleets that had once fought each other now moved in the same direction. Not together, but parallel. Each trying to reach the last system before the silence reached them. There were no alliances. No coordination. Only urgency. And fear. Because the silence was still advancing. And now, it was moving faster. The first arrival. The first fleet to reach the system expected something extraordinary. A shield. A hidden force. A defense mechanism powerful enough to resist the collapse. They found none of that. The system looked normal. A single star. A few planets. No massive structures. No advanced defenses. No signs of anything capable of stopping what was coming. At first, they thought the message had been wrong. Then they noticed something subtle. Their systems stabilized. The difference. Navigation errors disappeared. Sensor inconsistencies stopped. Communication signals became clear, perfectly clear, for the first time since the war began. Reality made sense again. Not completely, but enough to feel the difference. This system wasn't just untouched. It wasn't affected at all. The gathering. More fleets arrived. Then more. Different species. Different empires. Former enemies. All converging on the same point. For the first time since the collapse began, they existed in the same space without conflict. Not because they trusted each other, but because they were all seeing the same thing. And for once, it was consistent. The problem. Then the question came. The one no one wanted to ask. What happens when the silence reaches here? Because if this system wasn't part of the original structure, then it wasn't part of the dismantling process either. But that didn't mean it was safe. It just meant it was separate. And separation hadn't saved anything before. The arrival of the silence. They didn't have to wait long. At the edge of the system, the distortion appeared. Just like before. A boundary between existence and nothing. It moved slowly at first. Then stopped. For the first time since the beginning of the collapse. The silence paused. The impossible moment. All senses locked onto the boundary. All eyes focused on it. Waiting. Watching. Expecting it to continue. It didn't. It remained at the edge, unmoving, unchanging, as if it had reached something it didn't recognize or couldn't process. The realization. One of the observers finally spoke, quietly, almost afraid of being right. It doesn't know what this is. Silence filled the command channels. Because if that was true, then for the first time, the collapse had encountered something it couldn't resolve. The last chance. For the first time since the war began, there was uncertainty, not among the survivors, but within the silence itself. And that meant one thing. This was not the end. Not yet. For the first time since the collapse began, everything stopped. No fleets moving. No systems vanishing. No signals distorting. At the edge of the final system, the silence waited. Not advancing. Not retreating. Just there. And inside the system, what remained of the galaxy watched. The first real decision. Until this moment, no one had ever truly chosen anything. Every action had been reaction. Every plan had failed. Every attempt had only accelerated the collapse. But now, for the first time, they had time. And that made the situation more dangerous than ever. Because now, whatever they did next, would matter. Understanding the truth. The discovery from the lost station spread quickly among the survivors gathered in the system. The galaxy had been a structure, a constructed network, and the silence was dismantling it, system by system, connection by connection, until nothing remained. But this place, this one system, was never part of that design. It didn't belong. And that's why the silence had stopped. Not because it was defeated, but because it didn't know what to do next. The debate. The remaining leaders gathered, physically, for the first time. No projections. No remote signals. Just presence. And the question was simple. Do we stay, or do we act? Some argued they should do nothing. If the silence couldn't process this system, then staying still might preserve it. Survival through inaction. Others disagreed. They believed the pause wouldn't last. That the silence would eventually adapt, just like it had before. And when it did, there would be no second chance. Then came the third idea. The most dangerous one. The choice. If the silence was dismantling a structure, and this system wasn't part of it, then maybe the only way to stop the collapse was to break the structure completely. Not just here. Everywhere. Erase the pattern. Destroy the design. Remove the very thing the silence was following. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an attack. It was a decision. To end the system that defined the galaxy. The risk. No one knew what would happen. The silence might stop. Or it might consume everything instantly. Reality itself might collapse. Or something entirely new might emerge. There were no simulations. No predictions. No data. Just uncertainty. The one thing the war had never allowed. The final vote. There was no formal process. No counting. No agreement. Because deep down, they all understood the same thing. There was no safe option. Only a choice between letting the collapse finish or forcing something unknown to begin. And in the end, they chose the act. The fleets didn't fire weapons. They didn't activate devices. They did something far simpler. They broke connection. Not like the Severance Protocol. Not isolation. But destruction of the underlying structure itself. Navigation grids erased. Star mapping frameworks deleted. The relational positioning of systems, the very thing that defined the galaxy's structure, was dismantled. They didn't destroy space. They removed the pattern that gave it meaning. The reaction. At the edge of the system, the silence changed. For the first time, it moved unpredictably. The boundary flickered, distorted, lost definition, as if the rules it followed were no longer valid. The pattern it depended on was gone. The end, or beginning. Then everything happened at once. The stars didn't go out. They shifted. Positions changed. Distances lost meaning. The idea of a galaxy dissolved. Not destroyed. Unmade. And the silence, without a structure to follow, collapsed with it, not expanding, not consuming, just disappearing. The last record. In the final moments, one surviving system managed to record a single observation. The collapse has stopped. A pause. But so has everything else. What remains? No one knows what came after. Because what remained was no longer a galaxy. No empires. No borders. No war. Just scattered existence. Unconnected. Undefined. Free. Or lost. Final line. The war didn't end with victory. It ended with a choice. A choice to destroy everything that made the war possible. And in doing so, they may have saved something. Or erased it forever.